Alex Carlisle was not born into wealth. His early years were spent in a dilapidated house on the outskirts of a small town, where the winters were harsh and opportunities scarce. His father worked double shifts at a steel mill, while his mother took in sewing jobs to make ends meet. From an early age, Alex learned that survival required cunning and an unrelenting focus on self-preservation. He was not the strongest or the fastest, but he quickly realized that his sharp mind and ability to manipulate others could open doors that brute strength could not. By the time he reached his 20s, Alex had clawed his way into an Ivy League university through a combination of scholarships, loans, and sheer determination. There, he discovered his talent for finance and strategy. He didn't just excel academically, he thrived in social circles that would later become his stepping stones to success. Networking with the sons and daughters of America's elite, Alex learned how to play the game of influence. After graduation, Alex entered Wall Street with a hunger that set him apart from his peers. He wasn't content with merely earning a comfortable salary. He wanted it all: the penthouses, the cars, the recognition. Within a decade, he had built Carlisle Capital, an investment firm known for its aggressive tactics and high-risk ventures. While competitors hesitated, Alex thrived on taking calculated risks that often paid off spectacularly. But with great wealth came enemies. Behind closed doors, whispers circulated about Alex's unethical practices, insider trading allegations that never stuck, hostile takeovers that left thousands jobless, and partnerships with shadowy figures who operated in legal gray areas. To those who knew him personally, Alex was charming but cold, a man who saw relationships as transactions and loyalty as a weakness. By his 40s, Alex had everything he thought he wanted: a sprawling mansion in Connecticut, a private jet parked at Teterboro Airport, and a reputation as one of Wall Street's most formidable players. Yet beneath the surface of his carefully curated life was an undercurrent of fear. He lived in constant paranoia that someone would try to take what he had built, whether it was an ambitious rival or one of the many people he had wronged along the way. This fear manifested in peculiar ways. Alex surrounded himself with security teams that rivaled those of foreign dignitaries. His mansion was equipped with state-of-the-art surveillance systems and panic rooms designed to withstand any conceivable threat. Even his closest confidants noticed his growing obsession with self-preservation. The turning point came during a charity gala at one of Manhattan's most exclusive hotels, a gathering attended by billionaires, celebrities, and political figures. The event was meant to celebrate philanthropy, but for Alex, it was another opportunity to flaunt his wealth and cement his dominance in high society. That night began like any other for Alex. Expensive champagne flowed freely as he mingled with guests who showered him with compliments, thinly veiled as flattery. But as the evening progressed, something felt off. A group of masked men stormed into the ballroom, wielding firearms and shouting commands. Panic erupted as guests screamed and scrambled for cover. For Alex Carlisle, this was his worst nightmare come true. A direct threat to his life in a setting where his usual layers of protection were stripped away. As chaos unfolded around him, Alex's instincts kicked in. Not instincts of heroism or leadership, but raw survival. Amidst the pandemonium, Alex spotted an opportunity. One of his junior employees from Carlisle Capital, a young man named Ethan who had idolized Alex, was crouched nearby. Without hesitation or regard for Ethan's life, Alex grabbed him by the arm and pulled him close. Using Ethan as a human shield against the gunman's line of sight, Alex maneuvered toward an exit, while others remained frozen in terror. Ethan's eyes widened in shock as realization dawned on him. But before he could protest or resist, Alex barked orders at him under his breath. "Move! Don't stop!" The young man obeyed out of sheer confusion and fear. As they neared the exit, one of the gunmen noticed their movement and fired a shot. The bullet struck Ethan squarely in the chest, his body crumpling instantly against Alex's grip. Without so much as a glance back at Ethan's lifeless form, Alex bolted through the door and into the night. The incident made national headlines within hours. Masked gunmen target Manhattan Gala. The media praised law enforcement for their swift response in apprehending the criminals before more lives were lost. But amidst the coverage lay whispers about what had transpired inside. The rumors that Alexander Carlisle had used another person as a shield to save himself. For now, those whispers remained unconfirmed, a dark stain on an otherwise untouchable reputation. But for those who knew what truly happened that night, it marked the beginning of Alex Carlisle's unraveling, a man whose empire was built on ambition, but whose legacy would be defined by cowardice. The aftermath of the gala was a whirlwind of media coverage, police investigations, and public speculation. For Alex Carlisle, however, it was something far more personal, a test of his ability to control the narrative and protect his empire. In the days following the incident, Alex retreated to his Connecticut mansion, surrounded by his team of lawyers, public relations specialists, and security advisors. The story of the attack was dominating headlines, and while no one had publicly accused him of wrongdoing yet, Alex knew that whispers could easily turn into accusations. The first challenge came in the form of Ethan's family. Ethan Miller had been a bright, ambitious young man from a modest background, not unlike Alex in his early years. He joined Carlisle Capital fresh out of college, eager to learn from one of Wall Street's most successful figures. To his parents, he had been their pride and joy, a symbol of hope for a better future. When news of Ethan's death reached them, they were devastated. But their grief quickly turned to anger as rumors began to circulate about how their son had died. Ethan's father, a retired schoolteacher named Robert Miller, was relentless in seeking answers. He contacted other attendees from the gala, piecing together fragments of what had happened that night. Several witnesses confirmed seeing Alex and Ethan together during the chaos. Some even claimed to have seen Alex using Ethan as cover. These accounts were vague and unverified, but they were enough to fuel Robert's suspicions. Meanwhile, Alex's PR team worked tirelessly to suppress any damaging narratives. They issued carefully worded statements expressing condolences for Ethan's death while emphasizing Alex's own harrowing escape from the attackers. They painted him as a victim who had narrowly survived a traumatic ordeal, an angle that played well with sympathetic media outlets. But behind closed doors, Alex was anything but composed. The incident had shaken him deeply, not because of guilt or remorse, but because it exposed a vulnerability he had spent his entire life trying to conceal. For all his wealth and power, he had been reduced to a desperate man clinging to survival at any cost. And now there were people who might expose him for what he truly was. The second challenge came from within Carlisle Capital itself. Ethan's death had sent shockwaves through the company, especially among its younger employees who had seen him as one of their own. Whispers spread through the office about what really happened at the gala. Some employees began questioning whether they wanted to work for a man who would sacrifice others to save himself. Alex tried to quell dissent by holding an all-hands meeting where he addressed the tragedy in vague but emotional terms. He spoke about the importance of resilience in the face of adversity and promised to establish a scholarship fund in Ethan's name, a calculated move designed to deflect criticism while reinforcing his image as a benevolent leader. But not everyone was convinced. A handful of employees resigned in protest, citing ethical concerns about working for Carlisle Capital. Among them was Sarah Whitman, a senior analyst who had been close friends with Ethan. Before leaving, she sent an anonymous tip to an investigative journalist detailing what she believed had happened at the gala. As these challenges mounted, Alex found himself increasingly isolated. His once loyal inner circle began to fracture under the pressure. Some advisors urged him to come clean and take responsibility for his actions, arguing that honesty could mitigate the damage. Others insisted on doubling down on denial and discrediting anyone who dared to accuse him. Alex chose the latter path, a decision driven by fear rather than strategy. He instructed his legal team to threaten lawsuits against anyone spreading defamatory rumors about him. He also hired private investigators to dig into Robert Miller's past, hoping to find something that could be used as leverage against him. But these tactics only deepened the divide between Alex and those around him. His closest ally, Rachel Porter, a longtime friend and head of his PR team, began questioning whether she could continue supporting someone who seemed incapable of accountability. Rachel had always admired Alex's ambition and intellect, but she couldn't ignore the growing evidence that he lacked basic decency. The turning point came when Robert Miller went public with his suspicions during an emotional press conference outside his home in Ohio. Flanked by photos of Ethan as a child and young adult, Robert tearfully recounted what witnesses had told him about the night of the gala. "I don't want money," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "I don't want apologies that mean nothing. I want the truth about what happened to my son." The press conference went viral within hours, sparking a wave of outrage on social media. Hashtags like "Justice for Ethan" and "Carlisle Coward" began trending nationwide as people demanded answers from Alex Carlisle. For Alex, this was a nightmare scenario, an uncontrollable narrative spiraling out of his grasp. His carefully constructed image as a brilliant but principled businessman was crumbling under the weight of public scrutiny. As pressure mounted from all sides, Ethan's family, former employees, journalists, Alex found himself grappling with an unfamiliar sensation: doubt. For years, he had operated under the belief that success justified any means necessary. But now, faced with the possibility of losing everything he had built, he began to wonder whether his relentless pursuit of power had been worth it. Yet even in this moment of introspection, Alex couldn't bring himself to admit fault or take responsibility for Ethan's death. Instead, he doubled down on self-preservation, hiring crisis management experts and plotting ways to discredit Robert Miller before his accusations gained more traction. But deep down, Alex knew that this was only the beginning of his reckoning, a storm that would force him to confront not only the consequences of his actions, but also the man he had become. The fallout from the gala began to seep into every corner of Alex Carlisle's life, eroding the relationships he had carefully cultivated. Over decades, Alex had always prided himself on his ability to manage people, to keep them loyal through a mix of charm, intimidation, and calculated generosity. But now, the cracks were becoming impossible to ignore. The people around him, those he thought he could control, were beginning to slip away, leaving him more isolated than ever. Rachel Porter was the first to confront him. She had been by Alex's side since the early days of Carlisle Capital, helping him craft the public image that had made him a household name. Rachel wasn't just an employee. She was a confidant, someone who had believed in Alex's vision, even when others doubted him. But after the gala, something shifted. Rachel had seen the reports, heard the whispers from employees, and watched as Alex's denials grew more desperate. She couldn't shake the feeling that the man she had devoted her career to was not who she thought he was. One evening, Rachel arrived at Alex's mansion unannounced. The sprawling estate, with its manicured lawns and towering gates, felt suffocating as she walked through its halls. She found Alex in his study, staring at a wall of monitors displaying live feeds from his security cameras. He looked up as she entered, his expression guarded. "Rachel," he said, his voice flat. "I wasn't expecting you." She didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Alex, we need to talk." He gestured for her to sit, but she remained standing. The tension in the room was palpable as Rachel crossed her arms and fixed him with a steady gaze. "I've been with you for 20 years. she began. "I've defended you when people called you ruthless. I've justified your decisions because I believed in what you were building. But this is different." Alex leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "What are you talking about?" "You know exactly what I'm talking about," she said sharply. "Ethan Miller. The rumors about what happened that night. They're not going away. And honestly, I'm not sure they should." Alex's jaw tightened. "You're basing this on rumors, on hearsay? Rachel, you're smarter than that." "I've spoken to people who were there," she countered. "People who saw you use Ethan as a shield." His face darkened. "And you believe them? After everything we've been through?" Rachel hesitated for a moment before replying. "I don't want to believe it, Alex, but I can't ignore it either." For a brief moment, Alex's mask slipped. His shoulders sagged slightly and a flicker of vulnerability crossed his face. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the cold determination that had always defined him. "I did what I had to do to survive," he said finally, his tone devoid of emotion. "If you were in my position, you would have done the same." Rachel stared at him in disbelief. "Do you even hear yourself? You're justifying sacrificing an innocent man, someone who trusted you, to save your own skin." "He was in the wrong place at the wrong time," Alex said dismissively. "It's tragic, but it's not my fault." Rachel shook her head slowly. "You've always been willing to do whatever it takes to win, but this is beyond anything I can accept." She turned and walked toward the door without another word. As she reached for the handle, Alex called after her. "Rachel," he said quietly. She paused but didn't turn around. "You're making a mistake," he continued. "You leave now, and there's no coming back." For a moment she considered his words, the weight of 2 decades of loyalty pulling at her heart. But then she opened the door and walked out without looking back. Rachel's departure sent shockwaves through Carlisle Capital and beyond. Her resignation was seen as a damning indictment of Alex's character, a sign that even those closest to him were no longer willing to stand by his side. But Rachel wasn't the only one questioning their loyalty to Alex. Within the company, employees who had once idolized him began distancing themselves from his shadow. Some quietly updated their resumes and started looking for new opportunities. Elsewhere, others stayed but spoke openly about their disillusionment with their once revered leader. Even Alex's personal relationships began to unravel. His fiancée, Victoria, a socialite who had been drawn to Alex's charisma and wealth, started spending more time away from home, attending events without him and avoiding his calls. When they did speak, their conversations were strained and perfunctory. One evening, as they sat across from each other in their cavernous dining room, Victoria finally broke her silence. "Alex," she said softly, setting down her glass of wine, "I can't do this anymore." He looked up from his plate, his expression unreadable. "What are you talking about?" "This life," she said, gesturing vaguely around her. "The constant scandals, the paranoia. It's too much." "You knew what you were signing up for," he replied coolly. "Did I?" she shot back. "Because I didn't sign up to be with someone who values money and power over human lives." Her words stung more than Alex cared to admit. For a moment, he considered trying to convince her to stay, to promise that things would get better, but he knew it would be futile. "If that's how you feel," he said finally, his voice icy, "then go." Victoria left that night without another word. As these relationships crumbled around him, Alex found himself increasingly alone in his fortress-like mansion. A man surrounded by wealth, but devoid of genuine connection or trust. The isolation only deepened his paranoia and fueled his desperation to maintain control over a situation that was slipping further out of his grasp with each passing day. But even as he alienated those closest to him, Alex refused to confront the truth about himself or take responsibility for Ethan Miller's death. Instead, he doubled down on his efforts to silence critics and protect his legacy, unaware that his actions were only hastening his inevitable downfall. The storm Alex Carlisle had been trying to outrun finally reached its peak. The whispers about his actions at the gala had grown into a roar, amplified by relentless media coverage and the tireless efforts of Ethan Miller's father, Robert. What had once been a private tragedy was now a public reckoning, and Alex found himself standing at the center of it all, exposed and vulnerable in ways he had never imagined. Robert Miller's campaign for justice had gained traction far beyond what Alex had anticipated. The grieving father became a symbol of moral outrage, his quiet dignity and unwavering determination striking a chord with people across the country. News outlets followed him as he traveled from Ohio to New York City, where he held vigils outside Carlisle Capital's headquarters and gave interviews to anyone willing to listen. His message was simple but powerful. Someone needed to answer for his son's death. The public, already disillusioned with the excesses of Wall Street, rallied behind Robert. Protesters gathered outside Alex's mansion in Connecticut and his office in Manhattan, holding signs that read "Justice for Ethan" and "Carlisle the Coward." Social media exploded with calls for accountability, turning Alex into a symbol of corporate greed and moral bankruptcy. For Alex, the pressure was unbearable. He had always thrived on control of his company, his image, his destiny, but now control was slipping through his fingers. The walls of his mansion felt like they were closing in on him as he paced from room to room, barking orders at his staff and obsessively monitoring news coverage of the scandal. He barely slept, his mind racing with strategies to contain the damage. But no amount of spin or legal threats could stop what was coming. The final blow arrived in the form of an investigative exposé published by a major newspaper. The article, written by a journalist who had pieced together accounts from witnesses and former employees, painted a damning portrait of Alex Carlisle as a man willing to sacrifice anyone to protect himself. It detailed not only what had happened at the gala, but also years of questionable business practices that revealed a pattern of ruthlessness and self-interest. The exposé included an anonymous account from someone inside Carlisle Capital who confirmed what many had suspected, that Alex had used Ethan Miller as a human shield during the attack. While the source's identity remained protected, their words carried weight, adding credibility to the accusations that Alex had desperately tried to dismiss as baseless rumors. The fallout was swift and brutal. Investors began pulling their money from Carlisle Capital, triggering a financial crisis within the firm. Board members who had once been staunch allies turned against Alex, calling emergency meetings to discuss his removal as CEO. Lawsuits began piling up, not just from Ethan's family, but also from former employees who claimed they had been mistreated or coerced into silence about unethical practices. Even Alex's most loyal supporters started to distance themselves from him. Rachel Porter's resignation had already sent shockwaves through his inner circle, but now others followed suit. Longtime advisors quietly resigned or stopped returning his calls. His fiancée Victoria's departure became tabloid fodder, further tarnishing his reputation as stories emerged about their strained relationship. As his empire crumbled around him, Alex became increasingly paranoid and erratic. He rarely left his mansion, fearing both the protesters outside and the possibility of legal action that could lead to his arrest. His once pristine home became a fortress of solitude, a gilded cage where he spent hours alone in front of glowing monitors, watching as his world fell apart in real time. But even as everything unraveled, Alex refused to accept responsibility for what had happened. In his mind, he was still the victim, a man unfairly targeted by jealous rivals and an unforgiving public. He clung to this narrative with a desperation that bordered on delusion, convinced that if he could just weather the storm long enough, he could rebuild what he had lost. The turning point came during yet another sleepless night, when Alex received an unexpected phone call from one of his remaining advisors. The voice on the other end was calm but firm as they delivered devastating news. Robert Miller had filed a wrongful death lawsuit against him personally, seeking damages not just for Ethan's death, but also for the emotional toll it had taken on their family. The lawsuit wasn't just a legal threat, it was a moral indictment that struck at the very core of who Alex was. For years, he had operated under the belief that money could solve any problem, that with enough resources and influence, he could bend reality to his will. But now, faced with the prospect of being dragged into court and forced to confront his actions in front of a jury, even Alex began to feel cracks in his armor. In those moments of solitude after receiving the news, something inside him shifted, not toward remorse or redemption, but toward despair. For all his wealth and power, Alex realized that there were some things even he couldn't escape. Public scorn, legal consequences, and perhaps worst of all, the truth about himself. Rather than face these realities head-on, Alex retreated further into isolation. He stopped answering calls from his remaining allies and instructed his staff to turn away visitors at the gate. The once charismatic tycoon who had commanded boardrooms with ease now spent his days pacing empty halls and staring out windows at protesters chanting for justice beyond the iron gates of his estate. The man who had built an empire on ambition and cunning was now reduced to little more than a shadow, a prisoner of his own making trapped in a fortress built on lies. The days bled into weeks, and Alex Carlisle's world continued to collapse around him. The once proud tycoon, who had built an empire on his wits and unrelenting ambition, now found himself facing the one force he could not manipulate: the truth. It was a slow, agonizing process of erosion. His wealth, his reputation, and his carefully constructed identity stripped away piece by piece. Yet, in the depths of his despair, Alex began to confront something he had avoided for decades: himself. The lawsuit filed by Robert Miller became the centerpiece of a national conversation about accountability and morality in corporate America. It wasn't just about Ethan's death anymore. It was about what Alex represented to the public. He became a symbol of everything people despised about unchecked greed and power. The media's relentless coverage ensured that Alex's name was no longer synonymous with success, but with cowardice and betrayal. At first, Alex tried to fight back in the only way he knew how, through denial and deflection. His lawyers filed motions to dismiss the case, claiming there was no concrete evidence to support Robert Miller's allegations. His remaining PR team attempted to shift the narrative, portraying Alex as a victim of a smear campaign orchestrated by disgruntled former employees and opportunistic journalists. But these efforts fell flat. The public had already made up its mind, and no amount of spin could change that. As the court date loomed closer, Alex's isolation deepened. The mansion that had once been a symbol of his success now felt like a gilded prison. The staff had been reduced to a skeleton crew, most having left after months of unpaid wages. The sprawling estate was eerily silent, save for the distant chants of protesters who still gathered outside the gates. It was during this period of solitude that Alex began to reflect on his life, not out of choice, but necessity. With no one left to shield him from reality, he was forced to confront the decisions that had brought him to this point. He spent hours pacing the halls of his mansion, replaying moments from his past in his mind, the ruthless business deals, the friendships he had sacrificed for power, and, most hauntingly, the night of the gala. For years, Alex had convinced himself that his actions were justified, that survival in his world required making hard choices. But now, stripped of his wealth and influence, those justifications felt hollow. He couldn't escape the image of Ethan Miller's face in those final moments. the fear and confusion in his eyes as Alex used him as a shield. It was a memory that refused to fade, gnawing at him like an open wound. One night, unable to sleep, Alex wandered into his study and opened a box of old photographs he had kept hidden for years. Inside were images from his childhood, snapshots of his parents working tirelessly to provide for him, pictures of their modest home in Ohio, and a faded photo of himself as a young boy standing proudly next to his father outside the steel mill where he had worked. Looking at those photos, Alex felt a pang of something he hadn't experienced in years: shame. His parents had raised him with values he had long since abandoned: hard work, honesty, and compassion for others. They had sacrificed so much to give him opportunities they never had. Yet he had used those opportunities not to uplift others, but to trample over them on his way to the top. For the first time in decades, Alex allowed himself to feel something other than anger or fear. It wasn't guilt exactly. He wasn't ready for that. But it was a recognition that he had lost sight of who he once was and what truly mattered. The following morning, Alex made a decision that shocked even himself. He would settle Robert Miller's lawsuit. It wasn't an admission of guilt, at least not publicly, but it was a step toward taking responsibility for Ethan's death. His lawyers advised against it, warning that settling would be seen as an acknowledgement of wrongdoing and could open him up to further legal challenges. But Alex didn't care anymore about preserving his image or protecting what little remained of his fortune. The settlement negotiations were tense, but ultimately successful. Alex agreed to pay a substantial sum to Ethan's family, not just as compensation, but as an acknowledgement of their loss. He also established a foundation in Ethan's name dedicated to providing scholarships for underprivileged students pursuing careers in finance, a gesture that many saw as too little too late, but one that Robert Miller accepted with quiet dignity. The settlement marked a turning point for Alex, not because it redeemed him in the eyes of others, but because it forced him to confront the consequences of his actions head-on. For years, he had avoided accountability by hiding behind lawyers and PR teams. Now there was no one left to shield him from the truth. In the months that followed, Alex began dismantling what remained of Carlisle Capital. He sold off assets at bargain prices to pay off mounting debts and lawsuits. The once mighty firm that had dominated Wall Street was reduced to a shadow of its former self, a cautionary tale about hubris and moral compromise. But while Carlisle Capital crumbled, something unexpected happened within Alex himself. Growth. Stripped of everything he once thought defined him, his wealth, power, and reputation, he began rebuilding not an empire, but himself. He started volunteering at local charities under an assumed name, working quietly behind the scenes without seeking recognition or praise. He reconnected with distant relatives he hadn't spoken to in years, people who remembered him not as a millionaire tycoon, but as Little Alex from Ohio. It wasn't redemption, not yet, but it was a beginning. The courtroom was packed. Journalists lined the back rows, their pens poised and cameras ready to capture every detail of what had become one of the most sensational cases in recent memory. Though Alex Carlisle had settled the wrongful death lawsuit with Robert Miller months earlier, the legal system was not yet done with him. Federal prosecutors had been quietly building a case against Alex for years, investigating allegations of insider trading, fraud, and other financial crimes that had long been whispered about in the corridors of Wall Street. The Gala incident and the public outrage it sparked had given them the momentum they needed to finally bring charges. For Alex, this was the moment he had dreaded, but also, in some strange way, expected. He sat at the defendant's table, his once imposing figure now diminished by months of stress and isolation. His tailored suit hung loosely on his frame, and there were dark circles under his eyes that even makeup couldn't hide. He looked around the room, and saw no friendly faces, only reporters eager for a headline, former colleagues who had turned against him, and members of the public who wanted to see him fall. The trial was a spectacle. Prosecutors laid out a damning case, presenting evidence of years of unethical behavior that painted Alex as a man who had built his empire on lies and exploitation. Witnesses testified about shady deals and backroom agreements, describing a pattern of behavior that left no doubt about Alex's willingness to bend or break the rules to get ahead. But it wasn't just financial crimes that were on trial. It was Alex himself. The prosecution skillfully wove a narrative that connected his business practices to his actions at the gala, portraying him as a man who valued his own survival above all else. They called witnesses from that fateful night to testify about what they had seen: Alex grabbing Ethan Miller and using him as a shield, pushing past terrified guests in his desperate bid to escape. The testimony was devastating. One witness described how Ethan had looked confused and frightened in those final moments, his trust in Alex shattered by the realization of what was happening. Another recounted seeing Alex flee without so much as a glance back at Ethan's lifeless body. As these stories unfolded in court, Alex sat silently, his expression unreadable. He didn't react when witnesses pointed at him or when prosecutors described him as the embodiment of greed and cowardice. But inside, he felt like he was unraveling. Every word cut deeper than he expected, forcing him to confront truths he had spent his life avoiding. When it was finally time for Alex's defense team to present their case, their strategy was clear: deflect blame and emphasize his contributions to society. They argued that Alex's business ventures had created jobs and driven economic growth, painting him as a misunderstood visionary rather than a villain. They also tried to discredit witnesses by questioning their motives and reliability, but these arguments rang hollow in the face of overwhelming evidence and public sentiment. The jury didn't see a misunderstood genius. They saw a man who had sacrificed others for his own gain time and time again. The climax came when Robert Miller took the stand. His presence in the courtroom was electric. Everyone leaned forward as he began to speak. Unlike other witnesses, Robert didn't raise his voice or show anger. Instead, he spoke with quiet conviction about the son he had lost, the bright young man who had dreamed of making a difference in the world, but whose life had been cut short by someone he trusted. "I'm not here for revenge," Robert said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I'm here because my son deserves justice. Because people like Alexander Carlisle need to understand that their actions have consequences, not just for themselves but for everyone around them." His words hung in the air long after he finished speaking. Even Alex couldn't meet Robert's gaze as he stepped down from the stand. In the end, the jury deliberated for less than 2 days before returning their verdict: guilty on multiple counts of fraud, insider trading, and obstruction of justice. Though Alex wasn't charged criminally for Ethan's death, there was no legal precedent for such an act under those circumstances. The court of public opinion had already convicted him long ago, when the judge handed down the sentence: 15 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole. There was no audible reaction from Alex. He simply nodded slightly before being escorted out of the courtroom in handcuffs. Outside, protesters cheered as news of the verdict spread. For them, and for Robert Miller, it was a moment of vindication after months of pain and struggle. But for Alex Carlisle, it marked the end of everything he had built and believed in. As he was led away from the courthouse under heavy security, past jeering crowds and flashing cameras, he felt an unfamiliar sensation: emptiness. For years, Alex had defined himself by his success, by his ability to outsmart competitors and rise above challenges. Now, stripped of his wealth, power, and freedom, he was forced to confront a question he had avoided his entire life: who am I without all of this? The answer would come slowly over time. But not before Alex faced one final reckoning with himself behind prison walls. The transition from the opulence of his Connecticut mansion to the cold, sterile confines of a federal prison was nothing short of jarring for Alex Carlisle. The man who had once commanded boardrooms and dined with presidents now found himself reduced to a number, stripped of every symbol of his success. The clinking of cell doors, the droning hum of fluorescent lights, and the constant presence of other inmates replaced the solitude and silence he had grown accustomed to in his gilded isolation. For the first few weeks, Alex was a ghost of himself. He avoided eye contact with other prisoners, kept his head down during meals, and spent long hours lying on his bunk, staring at the cracked ceiling above him. The enormity of his fall from grace weighed on him like an anchor. He had always believed that he could control his destiny, that no matter how dire the circumstances, he could find a way to turn things in his favor. But here in this place, there was no boardroom to manipulate, no PR team to spin his story. There was only time, endless hours to reflect on the choices that had brought him here. The first turning point came during a routine work assignment in the prison library. Alex had been assigned to help organize books, a task he initially resented but quickly grew to appreciate for its simplicity and solitude. One day, while sorting through a pile of donations, he came across a tattered copy of Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. The title caught his eye. It was a book he vaguely remembered being recommended during one of those self-improvement seminars he had attended early in his career. With nothing better to do, Alex began reading. The words of the ancient Roman emperor struck a chord he hadn't expected. Aurelius wrote about accepting one's circumstances, about finding strength in adversity, and living with integrity even when the world seemed against you. For a man who had spent his entire life chasing external validation, money, power, recognition, the idea of finding peace within oneself was both foreign and oddly compelling. Alex started carrying the book with him everywhere, rereading passages during quiet moments in his cell or breaks in the library. Slowly but surely, its teachings began to seep into his consciousness. He realized that for all his wealth and influence, he had never truly been free, not from his own ambitions, not from his fears, not from the constant need to prove himself worthy. The second turning point came when he encountered Robert Miller again, not in person, but through a letter. About 6 months into Alex's sentence, he received an envelope addressed in neat handwriting. Inside was a single page with a brief note: "Mr. Carlisle, I don't know if you'll ever truly understand what you took from me and my family, but I've come to realize that holding on to anger won't bring Ethan back. I hope you use this time to reflect on your choices and find some way to make amends, not for my sake, but for your own. Robert Miller." Alex read the letter over and over again, each word cutting deeper than any courtroom testimony or media headline ever could. Robert's forgiveness, or perhaps it was simply his decision not to carry hatred any longer, was something Alex couldn't comprehend at first. How could someone whose life he had so profoundly damaged find it within himself to let go? It was an act of grace that Alex knew he didn't deserve, but couldn't ignore. The letter became a catalyst for change. Not an immediate transformation, but the beginning of a slow and painful process of self-examination. For the first time in years, Alex allowed himself to feel something resembling remorse, not just for Ethan's death, but for all the lives he had affected through his relentless pursuit of success. He began seeking out opportunities within the prison to contribute in small ways. He volunteered as a tutor for inmates, working toward their GEDs, using his sharp mind and financial expertise to help them understand math and economics. At first, it was simply something to pass the time, a way to distract himself from his own thoughts, but over time, it became something more meaningful. One inmate in particular stood out, a young man named Jamal, who reminded Alex painfully of Ethan Miller. Jamal had been incarcerated for minor drug offenses, but showed incredible potential and curiosity about business and finance. Alex took him under his wing, teaching him not just about numbers, but about navigating life's challenges with resilience and integrity, lessons Alex himself was still learning. Through these interactions, Alex began to see glimpses of redemption, not in grand gestures or public apologies, but in quiet acts of service that required no recognition or reward. He started writing letters to Robert Miller, not with any expectation that they would be read or responded to, but as a way of processing his own guilt and trying to articulate what he had learned. The final turning point came when Alex received word that Carlisle Capital, the company he had built from nothing, had officially declared bankruptcy. The news should have devastated him. Instead, it brought an unexpected sense of relief. For so long, Carlisle Capital had been an extension of himself, a monument to his ambition and ego. But now that it was gone, Alex felt unburdened in a way he hadn't anticipated. He realized that true growth wasn't about rebuilding what he had lost or reclaiming his former status. It was about letting go of the need for those things altogether. By the end of his first year in prison, Alex Carlisle was still far from redeemed in the eyes of society or even himself. But he was no longer the man who had walked into that courtroom months earlier. He still carried the weight of his past actions every day. But instead of running from it or trying to justify it, he faced it head-on. For perhaps the first time in his life, Alex wasn't focused on what he could gain or achieve. He was focused on who he could become. Years passed, and the world moved on from the scandal of Alexander Carlisle, the name that had once dominated headlines and been synonymous with greed and cowardice slowly faded into obscurity. New stories of corporate corruption and public outrage took its place, leaving Alex's downfall as nothing more than a footnote in the annals of Wall Street history. But for Alex, the passage of time marked something far more profound: the slow, painstaking process of rebuilding himself, not as a tycoon or a public figure, but as a human being. Prison life had stripped Alex of every external marker of success. There were no tailored suits, no private jets, no adoring crowds. What remained was a man forced to confront his own flaws and failures in the starkest terms. For years he had lived in denial, blaming others for his mistakes and justifying his actions as necessary for survival. But in the quiet monotony of prison life, there was no escaping the truth. Alex spent much of his time working in the prison library, where he continued to tutor inmates and read voraciously. His favorite books were those that explored themes of morality, redemption, and the human condition, works by Dostoevsky, Baldwin, and Camus. These stories resonated with him in ways he never would have imagined during his years as a high-powered executive. They forced him to grapple with questions he had avoided for most of his life. What does it mean to live a good life? Can someone truly change? And if so, how? His relationship with Jamal deepened over the years. Jamal eventually earned his GED and began taking correspondence courses in business management through a non-profit program that Alex had helped him apply for. Watching Jamal's growth gave Alex a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in decades. For once, his knowledge and experience were being used to help someone else rather than to further his own ambitions. But it wasn't just Jamal who benefited from Alex's mentorship. Other inmates began seeking him out for advice, not just on academics, but on life. They came to him with their fears about re-entering society after serving their sentences, their regrets about choices they had made, and their hopes for a better future. Alex listened without judgment, offering guidance when he could, and simply being present when he couldn't. Through these interactions, Alex began to understand something he had never grasped before: that true leadership wasn't about power or control. It was about service. It was about lifting others up rather than using them as stepping stones. The letters to Robert Miller continued throughout Alex's sentence. At first, they were sporadic and hesitant, filled with apologies that felt inadequate even as he wrote them. But over time, they became more reflective and honest. He wrote about his memories of Ethan, about the lessons he was learning in prison, and about his hopes for making amends in whatever small ways he could. Though Robert never replied directly, Alex heard through mutual contacts that Ethan's family had read the letters and appreciated them. It wasn't forgiveness, not entirely, but it was a step toward closure for both sides. When Alex was finally released after serving 10 years of his 15-year sentence, early release granted for good behavior, he stepped out into a world that barely remembered him. There were no reporters waiting at the gates, no protesters chanting his name, just an empty road stretching ahead into an uncertain future. He moved into a small apartment provided by a re-entry program for former inmates and began working at a non-profit organization that helped people transition out of prison life. The irony wasn't lost on him, that someone who had once wielded so much power now spent his days helping others navigate lives far removed from the one he used to lead. But instead of resentment or regret, Alex felt gratitude. He lived simply, walking to work each day, cooking his own meals, and spending evenings reading or writing letters to people who had been part of his journey. He stayed in touch with Jamal, who had gone on to start a small business using the skills Alex had taught him. Their friendship became one of the few constants in Alex's new life, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there could be light. One day, while walking through a park near his apartment, Alex came across a group of children playing soccer. He stopped to watch them for a while, their laughter and energy filling the air with a sense of hope he hadn't felt in years. As he stood there, he thought about Ethan Miller, the young man whose life had been cut short because of Alex's choices. He would never be able to undo what happened that night at the gala. That was a weight he would carry for the rest of his life. But standing there in that park, watching those children play under the open sky, Alex felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel before. Peace. His journey wasn't over. Redemption wasn't something that could be achieved in a single act or even a lifetime, but it was enough to know that he was trying. For once, Alexander Carlisle wasn't looking back at what he had lost or forward at what he might gain. He was simply living in the moment. And for a man who had spent most of his life running from poverty, from failure, from himself, that was its own kind of victory.